Charlene, you're on, and you will see the timer above, so you know the timing is started.
Right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. And welcome to everybody. It's so good to be with all of you. As a quick introduction for myself, I'm Charlene Louie, the Executive Director of NAME, the National Association for Multicultural Education. And once again, I welcome you. Today, I am with you from my home where I reside in Salt Lake City, Utah, on the indigenous lands of the Goshute, Shoshone, and Utes. It is my honor and privilege at this time to introduce to you Dr. Montero Sieberth. In the session titled Crafting Intercultural Education from Below, Lessons for the Global North. I'd like to share this with you about our presenter this morning. Dr. Montero Sieberth has over 4 decades of where she has taught and conducted intercultural research in Latin America, the United States, Spain, and the Netherlands. And she's attempting to do 4 things. First, to break down the invisibility of the Global South's knowledge production. Secondly, to bring to the forefront the tokenism with which such knowledge has been treated. And third, present its tapestry of knowledge. And fourth, to represent its universal appeal in questioning issues that legitimizes its epistemic value. I look forward to learning from our speaker and learning with all of you this morning. And once again, it is my honor to introduce to you today, Dr. Martha Montero Sieberth. Please, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see if we can have the presentation.
Just give me a second. I'm just
Yes.
picking it up. It was open for some reason, and I closed it. So just a second here. And let me know when you want me to move between here.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to thank all of you, and I particularly want to thank Manal because she's been industrious and keeping me on pace. Charlene, for your introduction, thank you, and Midi for being willing to have a representation from the Global South. And I know those are terms that are sometimes difficult today to talk about Global North and Global South, but those are the terms that geographically we're still using. I'm not going to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico. I will start with that. Okay, so I would like to start by the purpose of my presentation is to craft theory from below as opposed to theory from above. And the reasons for that is that often the knowledge production of the Global South is considered inferior or a lesser being than that of the Global North. And I think it is also important for teachers to know that there is a lot going on in the Global South that is productive and useful for people. And it breaks down the top-down models that we have been looking at and recognizes community-based education, what we've been talking about and I heard in the last session. And that's important to have those cosmologies and that way of thinking. The next slide, please. You can go right to the next one. It also, what I'm trying to do is to utilize interculturalidad, and I will use the Spanish for it, because even though languages may be eroded in the future in some places, I will continue to use the language from which it comes. Interculturalidad from the Global South is different than intercultural in English, because what it means is it really is trying to create authentic dialogue and communication by problematizing interculturalidad, by problematizing situations, but also to develop the competencies that allow for social practices and communication among students, teachers, families, and communities to take place. Next, please. With that, the purpose of this presentation is to use a decolonization perspective to help teachers strategize and develop intercultural learning competencies. That means we need to look at what is meant by cultural and what is meant by competency and where that will take us. So this means we need to look at decolonization because for people who have undergone colonialist thinking and have taken the shackles off of that, you begin to understand how power dimensionalities and how domination still occur in the classroom. And the idea is, how can we break out of that? And so I will be focusing today only on the methodology of interculturalidad. There's a whole range of it, but I will focus on it. And the reason I'm focusing on it is because this is the work of Armando Loera Varela, who passed away in February of 2022, a dear friend, a colleague. He created what is called the pedagogical laboratories, which are still ongoing in several parts of Latin America. He was first of all, a student of mine. He was a colleague of mine at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He worked with me in Guatemala on bilingual education practices, and he was a co-author of the classroom management piece, which has been disseminated by Bridges Project at the International Institute of Education at Harvard. He was so involved in teacher education that he not only studied teacher, recorded over 400 videos of teachers in their different practices in rural, urban, and in fact, in very private schools. And in having done this, he taught in 7 countries, and he did a lot of consulting for USAID, UNESCO, OECD, and he visited hundreds of schools in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is in his honor, since he was not able to present in the IAIE 2021 conference, was not able to be there. I was not able to talk for him. So this is my way of honoring him. Next. So the crafting of theory from below is really an offspring of the participatory action research of the 1950s and 1960s. And it is really based on reflective thinking, which places teaching in a non-bureaucratic, non-technocratic, and I'll say that strongly, and non-paternalistic framework. Teachers work on their discourses of coloniality and power and the structures that create these, and they discuss in open forums the idea of how to arrive at their own theories and how to make that work visible to others. And in many cases, it's a lifetime process. It's what they do for the rest of their lives. The next. So the roots of interculturalidad, which is an offspring of that crafting of theory, is basically an alternative that helps teachers question, requires them to focus, to revisit the vestiges of colonialism, and then to begin to think and transform those realities into actions that are productive with their students. It was begun in Latin America in 1979 through programs like Indigenous Bilingual Education, bicultural bilingual education, and intercultural bilingual education. And today it is so widely practiced that wake up, Global North, you are going to see much of it influencing you in the next years. And it's being promulgated by people in Costa Rica, in Argentina, Ecuador, it's probably in Colombia, but also in the United States. It is with the Latino populations, and it is certainly part of the multiliteracies, multilingual programs in the United States. The next one. So interculturalidad, which was actually consolidated by Ana Solano Campos, is really a sociocultural and political project because it believes in convivencia, the coexistence and social justice that you have across cultural groups. And the idea is that we need to understand the needs, the trajectories of the nation state, but at the same time create a third space. And that third space means the context between individuals so that there is reciprocity, something that has been left out of the present situation, and relationship building. And it also offers an axiological vision because it begins to show the theories and values of universal human rights, of morals with respect, of tolerance, of empathy and equilibrium. And it is a political utopia because it is towards the betterment of a democratic society. The next. In that sense, It uses indigenous culture as a starting point, but it means that we need to understand not only indigenous cultures, but communities, folk ways of knowing, how they come to make sense of their world in the everyday life. And it also means that we need to understand cultural identity. And in so doing, I think the global North could really profit from this by knowing, by negotiating, by confronting the historical past and coming to terms with its implications in the present. It may be very liberating and revitalizing for the global North. So the next slide. So if you look at it, when I talk about the global South, it doesn't include just Latin America. It includes African countries. It includes countries to the south, Australia. It includes countries, in fact, that have gained their own standing in their own nation state, but that have also begun to filter those ideas to the north. And in Latin America, it begins with action research, indigenous movements of the 50s and 60s. In the global north, it really started with a lot of the multicultural education movements of the civil rights and with the integration of racial minorities and ethnic groups. So you have these tour de forces creating these great educational movements, and obviously they've been facilitated by multicultural and intercultural education. The next slide. So what is important is to know who are the authors of this. And in Latin America, the ones that are in brown are the political fulcrums of what is the influences. Orlando Fals Borda with participatory action research, Paulo Freire with his whole notion of conscientization, Gunter Dietz, who's been doing intercultural education in Mexico, Julio Cesar Tovar, who's doing work in Colombia, Walter Bignolio and Catherine Walsh in Argentina and Ecuador, Tatiana Edith Vergara, who's working in Argentina, and Ana Solano Campos in Costa Rica. Next slide. From the global north, these are the influences that affected Armando Loera. He started with John Dewey's laboratories because that is where it begins. When you create a laboratory, you're creating a space where people can actually come and dialogue. And laboratory carries over the scientific realm. Kurt Leving's T groups are also part of that. The situated learning from Jean Love is part of that. And obviously the reflective thinking from Chris Argyes and Donald Schoen. But it is, again, Henry Giroux, Donald Oliver, and Paul Gorski who pushed the political envelope. And I have to say, it also takes in, and Nona was a professor for Armando in reflective thinking and portfolio learning. And Donald Oliver was his professor along with me. So he was influenced by all of these people, and Pete Hall and Alisa Simmerall and Etienne Wegner, Richard McDermott and William Snyder in cultivating communities to bring together all his ideas on this whole notion of laboratories of pedagogy. The next slide. So his methodology is really about making it possible for teachers to think jointly to transform education by being able to situate social injustices from their own organizational learning and hegemonic teaching, meaning that schools of education using direct teaching, using non-questioning and non-creative processes are in many ways creating gaps in the learning of teachers to really be creative and think out of the box. So the next slide would show you what that methodology begins to be. The pedagogical laboratory is a participatory approach, and it is basically based on teachers able to talk, to look at their practice, but to say, does my practice really match what my students know? Can I really see them learning from what I am doing? It improves their professional skills, but it also allows them to look at the needs of their students with each experience and to develop their own conceptual perspectives. Conflict is actually invited. Why? Because conflict gives rise to questioning, to raising more consciousness, and to be able to find problems and solve them. The next slide. in having done this, these are the goals that Armando set. First, to have training laboratories, but also to help others improve. In other words, it's not just my improvement in this process, but to improve. Someone had mentioned in the earlier presentation about how teacher training has not been that effective. Well, teacher training doesn't become effective if it's not incorporated into the mindsets of teachers and they do something with it. So this is to improve and to be able to accept and provide critical perspectives with each other. It is about argumentation, it is about thinking, it is about going back and forth. So the target is to do this, and the goal is to set up a program for this. And these are the countries that Armando was able to set up programs that are still in use today. In Paraguay, he worked with the Petrona Rodriguez de Francia Pedagogical Laboratory. In Colombia, he was able to develop programs in 9 different departments. If we go to the next slide. In Costa Rica, he built upon a program that I had begun of qualitative research in Costa Rica in 1983, and which had a 10-year commitment for teachers to change their practice. And he was able to then keep this going. And I must say, Costa Rica is one of those countries that maintains very much reflexive thinking. But it is in Mexico with the indigenous populations in Oaxaca, in Chiapas and Michoacan, where these efforts to have teachers really dialogue and see themselves in their own light, because as indigenous people, to see themselves in terms of their own language, their own thinking, their own processes, compared to those of the teachers in the urban centers or those more Mexicanized middle-class people, the teachers that they worked with, allows them to have a sense of community. Armando was able to develop a book for the Raramuri indigenous people of the state of Chihuahua. And in so doing, he was able to give them opportunities that had not been there. So much of his work centers on really making things happen from the bottom up. The next slide, please. So what we call the pedagogical laboratory is really a reflexive process. And it's a reflexive process where the analysis of what you do begins to have you think differently, bring together ideas, but not simply within a small group, but to bring in stakeholders so that you have a constant feedback loop in which you develop your skills and foster dialogue and an emancipatory fashion. The next slide, please. So this is his actual methodology. He would group teachers, they would find a location, they would actually decide how they would want to set up. But the first thing is to promote dialogue between the internal and external perspectives of a particular community of practitioners. In other words, set up teacher networks. That was the first beginning. And the idea is to be able to have dialogue as a key process, but also dialogue as a way to overcome dominant ideologies. If some teachers thought they were better than other teachers, the idea was to figure out how do you break down that dominance or that kind of strategy making that allows you to talk as equals. The second thing was to have an open and trusting climate of communication towards developing an open, legitimate democratic leadership. So now the emphasis is on the leadership of teachers and figuring out that from their own histories, their own expectations and perspectives, they need to talk about what those mean and whether those match the perspectives of their own students. And this is a way that different kinds of conversations could be stimulated. The next slide, please. The third step is autonomy in decision-making. The idea here is that to be able to make decisions, you have to dialogue and have sessions of dialogue that may take 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 weeks. But the idea is that when you have these kinds of dialogues, the communities themselves, the members from the communities, teachers with members of the community will be able to define their activities and will develop the kind of respect that is needed in order to forge forward. Then the next step, the fourth step, is the prioritization of topics. The teachers raise a whole list of topics that they would like to discuss with their students. And the idea is once they have prioritized these, they then produce them and take them into the communities that they're going to serve to consolidate that they can actually create something that is relevant to that community. The next slide shows that the next step on this is the external collaboration. Why? Because in this collaboration, the important thing is how they combine innovative procedures and ideas. This is where teachers get a chance to really bring in ideas from the community, ideas from their students, their own ideas, and to create a whole smorgasbord of possibilities, but with transparency and implementation. The sixth step, which was very vital to Armando, is that the day-to-day practice needs to be documented. Just as you're documenting this conference, it is vital information for others to see and to question and to raise. But all of this idea is that only when you have discussions that are fleshed out can such knowledge be legitimized. And it's creating a social contract amongst the teachers and the community members so they can work together. The next slide then takes me to the discussion of decolonization, deconstruction of categories, and reconceptualization. And here, because I'm cognizant of the time frame, I would like to say that in the global north, part of the problem that I see on the debates of diversity is inclusion and equity. But where you have inclusion, you also have exclusion. And when you talk about equity, it is very contextualized. So you need to understand more than that, the power dimensions of teacher education. And when you're dealing with teacher educators that are culturally and socially different from the children, you have a very different modality because it means you are included if you become like me. You're included if you have the same abilities, the same competencies. And the problem is there are often asymmetries. In the global south, the whole debate is how do you get marginalized participants to participate in a way that they can bring their cosmologies and center these with growing theories that face the reality of poverty. And I was thinking about the question of what is happening to education, particularly in countries where there are wars. What is happening to the schools that used to exist? What is happening to the very centers where children would have safe spaces to learn? And for me, it's important to understand that if you can create a school by sitting under a tree with chairs, then that becomes a school for a child. But these cosmologies need to be seen in terms of their social justices and injustices and educational access. So the decolonial critique is really about understanding that interculturalidad really is not just about the colonial past, but the colonial present, how we are living in the present. And it means about reframing the whole notion of intercultural education as an ethical and political project. The next slide will tell you that if we really think about multiculturalism and interculturalism, we need to move away from simply culture as an attribute, and we need to move away from preferential treatment of simply underrepresented groups, because I was one of those people that I often wondered when I was the first Latina at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And one of my professors said to me, "Are you here because you're a Latina, or is it because you really got the job?" And I said, "I hope it is my ability to teach and not the fact that I'm proud to be a Latina." So I bring that up because it is an issue, a thorny issue at this moment. So when we look at intercultural competency, I think we have to do much more in really redefining culture and to think about problematization, the discourses that we're using in it, the effective domains, and exploring the relationships that intercultural competency can create. And for that, I think the next slide would show you that instead of viewing culture as a noun that situates people and really reduces them to the definition, I think we need to think of it as a verb that allows the process of the historical construction of the normal from the us and from the them. And I think we need to see culture as a resource, as the everyday experience, the practices of every day. So to conclude, what I'd like to say is for the global North, I think there are lessons to be learned. And some of those lessons are how teachers can delink themselves and delink education from power relations and move into resistance. And I have to agree with Gorski. But I also feel that we need to help others accept and provide critical perspectives. And only that will we be able to change and transform the kind of education that we are seeing at this moment. So the next slide is, for me, I feel I need to contest the direct practices of teachers. I also need to see how I can provide spaces to question and see the child and the families in front of them as sources of knowledge. And the last thing is I need to see how interculturalidad can really break the mold and allow teachers to be creative beings. And from that, I leave you with the maize from Latin America, because it's found through all of Latin America. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monterosi. But we've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for being with us in spite of all the challenges, the health challenges that you have. So I hope you really feel well and you recover very quickly. So thank you. Thank you for being with us.